The black smoke was still choking the air above Oahu. The oil fires were still slick on the water, turning the harbor into a graveyard of twisted steel. It was December 8th, 1941, and the American heart was beating with a rhythm it hadn't felt in a generation. It was a rhythm of pure, unadulterated fury, and it pointed in one single direction, west, across the Pacific, toward the rising sun that had dared to burn them on a quiet Sunday morning. If you walked into a diner in Chicago, a steel mill in Pittsburgh, or a dusty general store in the Texas Panhandle, the conversation was identical. It wasn't about strategy, it was about revenge. The American people wanted to take the sleeping giant, wake it up, and hurl it straight at Tokyo. They wanted to sail the Navy right down the throat of the Japanese Empire. But thousands of miles away, inside the high-ceilinged, smoke-filled rooms of the War Department in Washington, the men staring at the maps were doing something that seemed to defy all human instinct. They were turning their backs on the Pacific. While the country was screaming for Japanese blood, General Marshall and President Roosevelt were quietly, grimly looking east, toward the Atlantic, toward a violently different enemy that hadn't dropped a single bomb on American soil. They were preparing to do the unthinkable. They were going to ignore the arsonist standing in the front yard with a torch in his hand, simply so they could go fight the mastermind living 3 blocks away. This was the Pearl Harbor paradox, a gamble of cold logic over hot blood.
To understand this decision, you have to step into the nightmares that kept men like General George Marshall pacing the floor at night. They weren't sweating over the Japanese Navy, as fearsome as it was. They were terrified by the ruthless mathematics of the Third Reich. By late 1941, Germany wasn't just a nation, it was a monster that had digested the industrial heart of Europe. Look at the map through their eyes. Hitler controlled the steel of the Ruhr, the factories of France, and the resources of the East. The American planners saw a terrifying domino effect waiting to happen. If Germany knocked Great Britain out of the war, and remember, Britain was hanging by a frayed thread, the British Royal Navy could fall into German hands. If that happened, the Atlantic Ocean would stop being a moat protecting the Americas. It would become a German superhighway. The combined shipyards of a conquered Europe could build an invasion force the United States simply could not repel. In the cold calculus of war, Japan was a dangerous predator, certainly. They could steal islands, they could bomb harbors, but Germany was an existential threat to civilization itself. Japan could wound America, Germany could kill it. So long before the first torpedo tore through the water at Pearl Harbor, the Americans and the British had already shaken hands in the shadows. In secret meetings, they had drafted the ABC-1 agreement. The blueprint was brutal, but simple. The Pacific would be a holding action, a defensive crouch. The real hammer was always meant to drop on Berlin.
But having a secret plan locked in a safe is one thing. Selling it to a grieving, furious nation is entirely another. Imagine the razor-thin political tightrope President Roosevelt was walking in those dark days following the attack. The American public was baying for Japanese blood. They didn't care about the Ruhr Valley or the shipping lanes of the Atlantic. They cared about the boys burning in the oil of Pearl Harbor. If FDR had gone on the radio that week and announced that the bulk of American power was heading to North Africa or Europe, the backlash would have been catastrophic. It could have shattered the national unity before the war even began. The isolationists, who had spent years arguing that Europe's war wasn't America's problem, would have screamed treason. Roosevelt was trapped in a corner, caught between the strategic necessity of fighting Hitler and the political mandate to fight Tojo. Then history delivered a twist of fate so strange, so incredibly reckless, that it saved Roosevelt from his own dilemma. 4 days after Pearl Harbor, while American strategists were sweating over how to pivot the war without causing a revolt at home, Adolf Hitler stood before the Reichstag. He didn't have to do it. The treaty with Japan only required Germany to help if Japan was attacked, not if they started the fight. But caught in his own hubris, Hitler declared war on the United States. In Washington, the relief was palpable. It was the greatest strategic gift the Axis powers could have ever given. Hitler had solved the paradox for them. He had linked the two wars. Now, fighting Germany wasn't just a choice, it was an act of defense.
Even with Hitler's declaration, sticking to the plan required a level of discipline that borders on the inhuman. Throughout 1942, the news from the Pacific wasn't just bad, it was catastrophic. The fall of the Philippines, the horror of the Bataan Death March. Every time a mother received a telegram from the Pacific Theater, the question hung heavy in the air. Why are we sending our best tanks to fight Rommel in the North African desert when our boys are dying in the jungles of Asia? General Marshall and the High Command had to hold the line against a tidal wave of public sentiment. They treated the global war like a patient on an operating table with two distinct wounds. One was a painful, gushing laceration on the arm. That was the Pacific. The other was a cancer attacking the heart. That was Europe. You tourniquet the arm, but you have to operate on the heart. It was a strategy of cold calculation that asked the American people to suspend their rage and trust the math. It meant asking men in the Pacific to fight with shortages and older equipment while the newest planes went to the Atlantic. It was unfair, it was bitter, and it was absolutely necessary. In the end, the paradox paid off. The industrial might of the United States broke the back of the Third Reich, and just as predicted, once the German colossus fell, the sun set rapidly on the Japanese Empire. It stands as a testament to the fact that in war, the hardest battles are often fought in the briefing rooms, where logic must triumph over the very human desire for revenge.
Consider for a moment the terrifying alternative. Step back and look at the map one last time, and imagine if rage had actually won the day. Imagine if the United States had ignored logic and thrown its full, unbridled weight against Japan in 1942. They might have crushed the Japanese Navy sooner. They might have taken Tokyo by 1944. But behind them, across the Atlantic, the lights of Europe would have gone out completely. Without the pressure of a Western front, the Soviet Union might have collapsed under the German boot. Hitler would have been bought the one thing he needed most: time. Time to perfect his V-2 rockets, time to mass-produce his jet fighters, and perhaps time to unlock the secrets of the atom. By the time America finally turned back to the east, they wouldn't have found a beachhead at Normandy. They would have faced a fortress Europe that was truly impregnable, a dark empire stretching from the Atlantic to the Urals. That is the haunting brilliance of the decision. It prevented a nightmare scenario that was terrifyingly close to reality. But we must never forget the cost of that brilliance. The Germany First strategy wasn't just ink on a piece of paper. It was a sentence served by the men in the Pacific. The soldiers on Corregidor who ran out of food, the Marines on Guadalcanal who fought with bolt-action rifles against machine guns, they were the ones who paid the bill. They were asked to hold the line with one hand tied behind their backs. They were the human collateral of a grand strategy, buying time with their lives so that the Allies could strike the heart of the Axis. In the quiet aftermath of history, this stands as the ultimate lesson of that leadership. True courage wasn't just about storming a beach or flying a sortie. True courage was the ability to suppress the screaming instinct for immediate justice in favor of the cold, hard path to ultimate victory. They ignored the fire in the living room to put out the fire in the basement, and in doing so, they didn't just save a country, they saved the world.
Stand on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, September 1945. The ink is drying on the surrender documents. The sky is filled with American aircraft, a swarm so thick it blots out the sun. It is the ultimate picture of total victory. But as we look at that moment of triumph, we have to recognize that it wasn't inevitable. It was engineered, and the blueprint was drawn in the darkest hour of the war, when American leaders chose to ignore their instincts and trust their intellect. The Pearl Harbor paradox is more than just a chapter in a history book. It is a profound study in the burden of command. It teaches us that true leadership is often a lonely business. It is easy to lead when the path is obvious and the crowd is cheering you on. It is agonizing to lead when the path is counterintuitive, when the people are screaming for blood, and you have to tell them to wait. You have to tell them that the enemy burning their homes is not the priority. General Marshall and President Roosevelt didn't just win a war, they mastered the emotional chaos of a nation. They understood that a nation, much like a person, sometimes has to swallow its pride to save its life. They realized that the loudest threat isn't always the most dangerous one.
Today, we live in the world that decision built. The geopolitical map of the 20th century was preserved because a few men in a smoke-filled room had the discipline to look past the smoke rising over Hawaii. They saw the chessboard for what it really was, not what their anger wanted it to be. In the end, the decision to turn away from the Pacific was the only reason the Allies were eventually able to return to it with such overwhelming force. They ignored the battle of the moment to win the war for the future.
When we look back at the Germany First strategy, it's easy to see it as a brilliant chess move. It looks clean in the history books, a triumph of intellect over emotion. But we must never sanitize the human cost of that genius. For the Marines rotting in the rains of Guadalcanal, or the sailors dodging torpedoes in the Coral Sea, it didn't feel like a masterstroke. It felt like abandonment. They were fighting in what became known as the orphan theater. They were the ones at the end of the supply chain. They fought with World War I-era rifles, while the brand new M1 Garands were shipped to Europe. They ate worm-ridden rice, while the massive convoys of food sailed to Britain. This is the dark, heavy anchor of the Pearl Harbor paradox. The strategy only worked because those men, feeling forgotten and forsaken, refused to break. They were the containment wall. If the Pacific line had crumbled, if the Japanese had taken Hawaii or Australia, the whole grand plan for Europe would have dissolved into chaos.
The victory at Normandy was bought in large part with the grit of the Pacific. So the paradox isn't just about generals looking at maps. It's about a nation capable of holding two contradictory realities in its head at once: the burning need for revenge and the icy discipline of survival. It demanded that America let a wound bleed so the body could live. And that remains the most brutal lesson of the war, that sometimes the path to ultimate victory looks terrifyingly like the path to defeat.
In the quiet that now settles over the history books, we often forget the terrifying uncertainty of that moment. We look back at 1941 through the comfortable lens of victory, assuming the outcome was inevitable. It wasn't. The Germany First strategy was a high-stakes wager played with human lives on a global table. It relied on a fragile belief that the American spirit was strong enough to endure humiliation in the Pacific in order to secure salvation in the Atlantic. It required a democracy, usually messy, loud, and driven by the passions of the moment, to act with the cold, steely precision of a machine. It demanded patience from a people who are famous for their impatience. And that is the enduring irony of the Pearl Harbor paradox. The attack on Hawaii was designed to break the American will. It was meant to shock the United States into a fearful, negotiated peace. Instead, it did the exact opposite. It awakened a sleeping giant, yes, but more importantly, it awakened a giant that was capable of thinking before it struck. The Japanese High Command counted on American rage. They didn't count on American discipline. And in the end, that discipline was far more lethal than any bomb. The United States defeated Japan not by rushing blindly into the fire, but by systematically dismantling the world that allowed the fire to burn. The ultimate truth of the war was this: to truly avenge the attack on Pearl Harbor, America first had to save the world from Berlin.
When the history of the 20th century was finally written, the smoke cleared to reveal a single, undeniable truth. The decision to fight Hitler first was the hinge upon which the modern world turned. It is a terrifying thought experiment to imagine a timeline where emotion ruled the day, a world where the United States chased the Japanese fleet across the Pacific in a blind rage, while Europe descended into a dark, permanent night under the swastika. We avoided that darkness only because a handful of men dared to be unpopular. They dared to be cold when the world was running hot. This is the final, enduring legacy of the Pearl Harbor paradox. It redefined what it meant to be a superpower. It demonstrated that true strength isn't just about the size of your fist or the capacity of your factories. It is about the clarity of your vision. It was a graduation moment for a young nation stepping onto the global stage. America had to learn the hardest lesson of adulthood, that doing the right thing often feels completely wrong while you are doing it. So when we remember the twisted steel of Battleship Row and the oil staining the waters of Hawaii, we should also remember the quiet, smoke-filled rooms in Washington. We should remember the maps, the grease pencils, and the heavy silence of the strategists. Because while the attack on Pearl Harbor started the war, it was the paradox, the refusal to fight the obvious battle, that actually won it. It was the ultimate victory of the long view over the short fuse. If you go to Pearl Harbor today and stand on the white platform of the memorial, looking down into the murky green water, you can still see the oil. They call it the Black Tears. It still bubbles up from the rusted hull of the USS Arizona, drop by drop, 80 years later. It is a persistent, visceral reminder of the pain and the fury of that Sunday morning. But as we stare into that water, we must realize that the true monument to that generation isn't made of steel or stone. It is made of the invisible, agonizing discipline they exercised in the days that followed. We live in an age of instant reaction. When we are hurt, the instinct is to lash out. When we are threatened, we want to strike the thing standing right in front of us. The Pearl Harbor paradox stands as a towering rejection of that impulse. It reminds us that sometimes the absolute hardest thing to do in a crisis is to pause, to look at the whole board, to realize that the enemy shouting the loudest might not be the enemy that can destroy you. The United States didn't win World War II simply because it had more steel or more money. It won because in its moment of greatest agony, it refused to lose its head. It won because its leaders understood that vengeance is a dish best served not just cold, but with absolute terrifying precision. That is the lesson that floats above the wreckage. The ultimate power of a superpower lies not in its capacity for violence, but in its capacity for strategy. And the decision to turn away from the Pacific remains the greatest strategic gamble and the greatest victory in the history of American warfare.